The Boy in the Night. The town of Maplewood was the kind of place where nothing truly bad ever seemed to happen. The streets were lined with old oak trees, their golden leaves whispering in the night breeze. White picket fences surrounded well-manicured lawns, and porch lights flickered warmly, giving the neighborhood an almost picture-perfect charm. But Officer Daniel Carter had been a cop long enough to know that appearances could be deceiving. Daniel had transferred to Maplewood from the city a year ago, trading high-speed chases and late-night drug busts for what he hoped would be a quieter life. He told himself he was tired of the chaos, the endless violence, and the cases that haunted his dreams. Maplewood was supposed to be different, a place where police work meant the occasional missing pet or neighborhood dispute. But despite the town's postcard-perfect exterior, Daniel could never fully shake the feeling that something was off. It was just past 10 o'clock when Daniel turned onto Sycamore Street, his patrol car gliding smoothly over the freshly paved road. He took a slow sip of his coffee, lukewarm and bitter, and adjusted the radio on his dashboard. It had been a slow night. Too slow. He let out a breath and glanced at the glowing numbers on the dashboard clock, 10:13 p.m. Then he saw movement. A small figure shot out from an alleyway, stumbling into the middle of the road. Daniel's pulse spiked as he slammed the brakes, the tires skidding slightly before coming to a stop. The boy was frozen in the headlights, his tiny hands gripping the hem of his oversized shirt, his shoulders rising and falling with ragged breaths. Daniel's heart clenched the moment he saw it. The shirt, once white, was smeared with blood. The boy couldn't have been more than 9 or 10. His face was streaked with dirt and something darker, tears, sweat, or maybe even more blood. His lips were trembling, as though he wanted to say something but couldn't force the words out. Daniel threw open his door and stepped out, moving carefully. He had spent years dealing with frightened victims, and he knew sudden movements could send them into shock. "Hey, buddy," he said, keeping his voice calm. "You're safe now." "What happened?" The boy's chest rose and fell rapidly, his breath hitching. His wild, terrified eyes darted behind him, toward the alley. Daniel followed his gaze, his stomach twisting. The alley was dark, a narrow passageway squeezed between two old brick buildings. Shadows stretched long and deep, hiding whatever was inside. The boy opened his mouth, but his voice was barely a whisper. "She needs help." Daniel's throat tightened. "Who?" he asked gently, crouching to the boy's level. "Who needs help?" The boy swallowed hard, shaking his head as if trying to get the words out. Then, in a quivering voice, he said, "My sister." Daniel's gut clenched. "Where is she?" The boy's hand shot out, pointing toward the alley. His small fingers trembled as he whispered, "In there." Daniel exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. He glanced at the alley, then back at the boy. "Okay. You're doing great, buddy. What's your name?" The boy hesitated. "Ethan." "Okay, Ethan," Daniel said. "Is your sister hurt?" Ethan nodded frantically, his lower lip quivering. He said he was gonna hurt her more if I didn't run. He told me not to tell anyone, but I had to." His breath hitched again, and he clutched at the bloody fabric of his shirt. "I had to find someone." Daniel felt a cold rage settle in his chest. "You did the right thing, Ethan." He reached for his radio, but the second he pressed the button, Ethan's eyes widened in panic. "No. No police," he pleaded, gripping Daniel's wrist. Daniel frowned. "Ethan, listen to me. If your sister's in trouble, we need to." "He'll hear you," Ethan whispered urgently. "If he hears the radio, he'll hurt her." He said so. Daniel's blood ran cold. Whoever he was still inside. And if what Ethan said was true, his sister was still in danger. Daniel took a deep breath and nodded. "Okay. No radio." He turned to his patrol car. "I need you to get inside and lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone but me. Understand?" Ethan hesitated, his hands shaking. "But what if?" "I'll get her," Daniel promised. "But I need you to stay safe." After a moment, Ethan nodded. He climbed into the car, locking the doors as instructed. Daniel turned back to the alley. The blood on Ethan's shirt told him that whatever had happened wasn't over yet. Every second counted. With his hand resting on the grip of his gun, he took a slow step forward. The night swallowed him whole as he entered the darkness. Into the darkness. Officer Daniel Carter stepped into the alley, his boots crunching softly against the damp pavement. The moment he left the safety of the streetlights, the air seemed to thicken, pressing in around him like a warning. The buildings on either side loomed high, their brick walls stained with years of neglect. Garbage bins lined the narrow path, their contents spilling onto the ground in dark, misshapen piles. A flickering street lamp at the alley's far end cast eerie, stuttering shadows, making it impossible to see what lay beyond. Daniel's instincts screamed at him, this was a trap. But there was no turning back. Somewhere in this alley, a little girl was in danger. He moved carefully, his right hand resting on the grip of his holstered gun. His heartbeat drummed steadily in his ears, but his breathing remained controlled. Years of experience had taught him how to suppress fear, how to push past the primal urge to hesitate. Then, a sound. A muffled sob. Daniel froze, his ears straining against the silence. It had come from ahead, past a rusted dumpster near the alley's bend. He inched forward, his free hand steadying himself against the rough brick wall. A soft shuffle. A sniffle. He rounded the corner, his eyes darting between the piles of debris. Then he saw her. A small girl, no older than 6 or 7, curled up behind an overturned crate. Her tiny frame was trembling, her face streaked with dirt and something darker. Blood. Daniel's chest tightened. She had a deep gash on her left arm, the wound fresh, the blood dripping onto the concrete. Her dress, once light pink, was torn and stained. But it wasn't just the injury that made Daniel's gut twist. It was her eyes. Wide, terrified, pleading. She flinched as he took a step forward, pressing herself deeper into the shadows, as if trying to disappear. Daniel crouched down, keeping his voice soft. "Hey, sweetheart. My name's Daniel. Your brother sent me." The girl's lips parted, her breath shallow. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's safe," Daniel assured her. "He's waiting for you." For a moment, relief flickered in her expression. But then, just as quickly, fear returned. "He's still here," she choked out. Daniel's pulse spiked. "Who?" he asked, already knowing the answer. The girl's eyes darted past him, toward the darkness further down the alley. Her fingers clutched at her torn dress, her shoulders curling inward as if bracing for something horrible. "The bad man," she whispered. A chill slithered down Daniel's spine. Every nerve in his body went on high alert. He turned his head slightly, scanning the alley behind him. The shadows twisted and shifted, but there was nothing. No movement. No sound. But someone was there. Watching. Waiting. Daniel reached for his radio, ready to break his promise to Ethan. Whatever fear the boy had about calling for help, it didn't outweigh the very real threat that was lurking in the dark. But before he could press the button, a voice. Low. Raspy. Dripping with malice. "She's mine." Daniel spun, drawing his gun in one swift motion. His eyes swept the alley, searching. The voice had come from somewhere nearby, but the darkness was thick, the shadows stretching deep into the night. Then, a figure stepped forward. At first, Daniel could only make out the shape, tall and thin, moving with an unnatural slowness. The man emerged from behind a stack of wooden pallets, his face hidden beneath the hood of a tattered sweatshirt. His hands, long, bony fingers, hung loosely at his sides. Daniel didn't hesitate. He aimed his gun directly at the figure. "Police," he barked. "Get on the ground. Now." The man didn't move. Didn't flinch. Didn't even blink. Instead, a sickening grin spread across his face, his teeth yellowed and uneven. "You shouldn't have come," he murmured. Daniel's grip tightened. "I won't say it again. Get on the ground." The man let out a breathy chuckle, his head tilting slightly. "You don't understand," he said. "She belongs to me." Daniel's stomach churned. Who was this man? What had he done to the girl? And worse, what had he planned? Daniel took a calculated step forward, keeping his gun trained on the suspect. "You're not going to hurt her," he said, his voice steady. "It's over." The man's grin widened. "No, officer," he whispered. "It's just beginning." And then, he lunged. It happened in an instant. Daniel fired, once, twice, but the man was fast, unnaturally so. He twisted his body, avoiding the shots with an almost inhuman agility. In the same motion, he grabbed the rusted dumpster beside him and shoved it forward with shocking strength. The metal container crashed into Daniel, slamming him backward. Pain exploded through his ribs as he hit the ground, his gun skidding across the pavement. The girl screamed. Daniel groaned, his vision blurring for a moment. But he didn't have time to recover. The man was moving, toward the girl. Daniel didn't think. He reacted. Ignoring the pain in his ribs, he kicked out, his boot catching the man's ankle and sending him stumbling. It was only a second, but it was enough. Daniel lunged for his gun. His fingers barely grazed the grip when the man recovered, his bony hands reaching. A loud bang shattered the night. For a moment, everything was still. Daniel's breath was ragged as he looked up, gun still aimed. The man had stopped moving. A slow, wet gasp escaped his lips as he staggered backward. He lifted a shaking hand to his chest, where dark crimson was beginning to spread. Then, with a final wheeze, he collapsed. Silence. Daniel didn't move for a second, his body still locked in adrenaline-fueled tension. His mind screamed at him to keep his guard up, to be ready for another attack. But the man didn't get up. Didn't move at all. The girl was still curled up against the wall, her tiny hands pressed to her mouth. Her eyes were wide, unblinking. Daniel took a slow breath. Then another. It was over. But as he looked down at the lifeless figure on the ground, something didn't feel right. The man's body was oddly still. Not just the stillness of death, but something else, something unnatural. And then Daniel noticed something chilling. The blood spreading across the pavement, it was wrong. Darker than it should be. Thicker. Almost black. Daniel's pulse pounded. Something was very, very wrong. And he had a terrible feeling. This nightmare was far from over. The nightmare unfolds. The alley was unnervingly silent. The only sound was the distant hum of the city, oblivious to the horrors that had just unfolded in its darkened corner. Officer Daniel Carter's breath came in short, sharp bursts as he slowly rose to his feet, his ribs aching from where the dumpster had slammed into him. His hands, still gripping his gun, trembled slightly. Not from fear, he had faced danger before. No, this was something different. Something unnatural. His eyes remained locked on the lifeless body of the man he had just shot. The blood spreading beneath him was wrong, thicker, darker than any blood Daniel had ever seen. It almost seemed to move in the dim light, glistening like oil. And then, the worst part. The smell. A sickly sweet, metallic stench filled the air, suffocating and nauseating. It wasn't the usual scent of death. This was something else, something decayed, as if whatever had just been killed had already been rotting before the bullets even hit. Daniel swallowed hard, forcing himself to step forward. The girl, Ethan's sister, was still huddled against the wall, her tiny frame shaking violently. Her hands were clamped over her mouth, as if she were trying to keep herself from screaming. He holstered his gun and crouched in front of her, doing his best to keep his voice steady. "Hey. Hey, sweetheart, it's okay." She didn't respond. She wasn't even looking at him. Her wide, tear-filled eyes were fixed on the body. Daniel turned his head slightly, glancing back. And then the man moved. A slow, unnatural twitch of the fingers. A slight jerk of the leg. A sickening pop echoed through the alley as his spine shifted. Daniel didn't think. He grabbed the girl and bolted. Running from the impossible. The alley blurred around them as Daniel sprinted, the child clutched tightly in his arms. His adrenaline-fueled legs propelled him forward, his boots slamming against the pavement. Behind him, a grotesque, wet gurgle. Then a rasping voice, more twisted and hollow than before. "You shouldn't have done that." Daniel didn't look back. He burst out of the alley onto the main street, his lungs burning. His patrol car was still there, the headlights casting a bright beam into the night. He reached the passenger door, yanked it open, and shoved the girl inside. "Stay down," he ordered, slamming the door shut. Then he turned. Gun drawn. Breath held. But the alley was empty. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. His body screamed for him to get in the car, drive away, and never look back. But his police instincts refused. He couldn't leave without knowing. With cautious steps, he moved forward, keeping his gun raised. His mind raced through possibilities. Maybe the suspect had been wearing body armor? Maybe the bullets hadn't hit anything vital? Maybe shock had kept him moving for a few seconds before he collapsed for good? But that sound. That horrible, cracking noise, like bones snapping back into place. Daniel swallowed hard, rounding the corner back into the alley. Nothing. No body. Just the dark puddle of thick, blackish blood. The man was gone. Daniel exhaled sharply, his grip tightening on his gun. What the hell was going on? A rustling noise. Daniel spun. And then something charged at him from the shadows. The attack. A blur of movement, fast, too fast. Daniel fired. Once. Twice. 3 times. The bullets hit, he could see them hit. But the figure kept coming. A cold, inhuman grip latched onto his arm, its fingers pressing into his flesh like iron clamps. Daniel gritted his teeth, struggling, but the thing was too strong. Then, pain. A sharp, searing pain in his shoulder as teeth sank into him. Daniel roared in agony, his knee jerking up instinctively. He felt the impact as it connected with his attacker's ribs, forcing the creature to release him. He staggered back, gripping his bleeding shoulder. The thing, the man, wasn't a man anymore. The hood had fallen back, revealing a grotesquely distorted face. The skin was grayish, stretched unnaturally tight over its skull. Its eyes were sunken, black pits, and its mouth was wrong. The teeth, jagged, too many, too sharp. And it was smiling. Daniel's stomach twisted. "What the hell are you?" he rasped, his gun trained on the thing's chest. The creature cocked its head, that eerie smile never fading. Then, in that same rasping, broken voice, it spoke. "She belongs to us." Daniel didn't hesitate. He fired again. Right between the eyes. The creature jerked backward, its head snapping at an unnatural angle. It collapsed. This time, Daniel didn't wait to see if it would get back up. He turned and ran. Escape and realization. He reached the patrol car in seconds, wrenched open the door, and threw himself inside. The girl whimpered beside him, curling into the seat. Daniel slammed the doors locked. Then he gunned the engine. The car screeched as he peeled away from the alley, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His shoulder throbbed, his breath ragged. In the rearview mirror, the alley stood empty. But Daniel knew. That thing wasn't dead. Not really. He glanced at the girl, her tiny frame shaking uncontrollably. She was watching him with terrified eyes. She knew, too. "Sweetheart," he said, his voice hoarse. "Tell me everything." The girl swallowed hard. Then, in a small, broken voice, she whispered. "They're coming for us." Daniel's hands clenched on the wheel. He had a sinking feeling. This nightmare was just beginning. The truth buried in blood. A city that hides its monsters. The patrol car sped through the dimly lit streets of Silver Hills, its tires screeching as Officer Daniel Carter made a sharp turn onto the main road. His hands gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, but his mind raced even faster. The girl, Ethan's sister, sat curled in the passenger seat, her small frame trembling. Her tear-streaked face stared blankly out the window, her fingers clenching the edges of her blood-stained dress. Daniel stole a quick glance at her. They had escaped, for now. But deep down, he knew the nightmare wasn't over. Something in that alley wasn't human. And it had spoken. "She belongs to us." Daniel exhaled sharply. Who was she? And what the hell did it mean? He needed answers. Now. Flipping the police radio on, he called it in. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12. I need backup at my location." Silence. Static crackled over the speaker. Daniel frowned, adjusting the frequency. "Dispatch, do you read me?" More static. Then, something worse. A low, rasping breath. It was faint, barely audible over the hum of the car, but unmistakable. Someone was there. Listening. Daniel's stomach twisted. He clicked off the radio. He was on his own. He pressed the accelerator harder. If he couldn't rely on dispatch, there was only one person left in this town he could trust. Sheriff Henry Dawson. The sheriff's warning. Sheriff Dawson's house sat on the outskirts of Silver Hills, nestled behind a dense stretch of woods. It wasn't the kind of home you'd expect a lawman to own, an old cabin, weathered by time, surrounded by a rusting fence. The place always made Daniel uneasy, but right now, it was the only safe place he could think of. He parked the cruiser in the gravel driveway, shut off the engine, and turned to the girl. "Stay in the car," he said. "Lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone except me." She nodded silently. Daniel stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel. He made his way to the front door and knocked hard. Nothing. He knocked again. This time, he heard slow, heavy footsteps inside. The door creaked open, revealing Sheriff Dawson, barefoot, wearing an old flannel shirt, a shotgun slung loosely in his right hand. His tired eyes flicked over Daniel, then to the patrol car. "Carter," he muttered. "It's late. I don't have time for this, Sheriff. Something's wrong. Really wrong." Dawson studied him for a long moment. Then, without a word, he stepped aside and let him in. The file no one was supposed to see. The cabin smelled of tobacco and old wood. The walls were lined with bookshelves, most of them filled with case files rather than novels. Dawson had been in law enforcement longer than Daniel had been alive. He was old school, the kind of sheriff who believed in doing things his way. He motioned for Daniel to sit. Instead, Daniel went straight to the point. "There's something going on in this town, and I need you to tell me what the hell it is." Dawson leaned against the kitchen counter, lighting a cigarette. He exhaled slowly before speaking. "Tell me what you saw." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Not until you tell me what you know." For a long moment, Dawson didn't say anything. Then, he sighed and moved to a locked cabinet near the fireplace. He pulled out a ring of keys from his pocket, inserted one into the lock, and opened it. Inside were old police files. Dawson flipped through them until he pulled out a folder and tossed it onto the table. Daniel picked it up. The label on the front read, "Missing Persons, Silver Hills, Unresolved Cases." Confused, Daniel opened it. Inside were dozens of photos of missing children. Some of them dated back over 30 years. And then, near the bottom of the stack, a photo of Ethan and his sister. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. "What the hell is this?" Dawson's expression was grim. "I was hoping you wouldn't get involved in this, Carter. But I guess that was wishful thinking." Daniel's grip tightened on the folder. "Start talking. Now." Dawson exhaled. Then, in a low voice, he said, "This town hides things, Carter. Things that don't make sense. And once you see them, they don't let you go." Daniel's mind raced. The creature in the alley. The radio interference. The fact that dispatch never responded. "Are you saying the whole town is covering this up?" Dawson shook his head. "Not everyone. Most people don't know. But the ones who do," his voice trailed off. He stared at the photo of Ethan and his sister. "They don't live long enough to talk about it." Daniel's blood ran cold. He had to get Ethan's sister out of here. "The mark." Daniel stood abruptly. "I need to get her out of Silver Hills. Right now." Dawson's gaze darkened. "It's too late for that." "What the hell are you talking about?" Dawson put out his cigarette and rolled up his sleeve. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. A mark was burned into the sheriff's skin, just below his wrist. A symbol, almost like an eye, carved deep into his flesh. "I got this when I first tried to leave Silver Hills," Dawson said quietly. "I drove all the way to the next state. Thought I was free." Daniel swallowed. "And?" Dawson smiled grimly. "The moment I crossed the county line, I woke up right back here. Sitting in my house, like I'd never left." Daniel's heart pounded. "That's not possible." Dawson let out a hollow chuckle. "Yeah. That's what I thought too." Suddenly. Bang. 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 Someone was pounding on the front door. Daniel's hand flew to his gun. He exchanged a glance with Dawson, whose expression had gone dead serious. Then, from the patrol car outside, a scream. Daniel's blood turned to ice. He turned and sprinted for the door, wrenching it open. The patrol car's doors were still locked, but the girl was gone. In her place, scratched into the condensation on the windshield, was a single word. "Mine." Daniel staggered backward. The cold night air pressed in around him, thick and suffocating. And then, deep in the woods beyond Dawson's cabin, he saw them. Dark silhouettes, standing impossibly still. Watching. Waiting. Dawson stepped up beside him, shotgun in hand. "You should have left this alone, Carter." Daniel swallowed hard, his heart hammering against his ribs. "But you didn't." And now, they were coming. The shadows that whisper vanished into darkness. The scream still echoed in Daniel Carter's ears as he stood frozen, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His pulse pounded in his head, drowning out every rational thought. The girl was gone. The word scratched into the windshield, mine, burned in his vision like a brand. His training told him to act, search the perimeter, call for backup, do something. But a sinking realization clawed at his gut. Backup wouldn't come. Nobody in this town would help. Beside him, Sheriff Dawson chambered around in his shotgun, his expression unreadable. "She's still alive," Dawson said, scanning the darkened tree line. "But if we don't move now, she won't be for long." Daniel tore his gaze from the car and followed Dawson's line of sight. The forest beyond the cabin was wrong. It wasn't just dark, it swallowed the light. The trees, usually visible even in the dim glow of the porch lamp, had become mere shadows. Shapes moved between them, silent and watching. And then, as if the night itself exhaled, came the whispers. Low, breathy voices slithered through the cold air. Daniel's fingers tightened around his gun. "What the hell is that?" Dawson's jaw clenched. "The ones who don't exist. A town that won't let you leave." Daniel turned toward Dawson, his patience wearing thin. "Enough riddles. What is this? Who took her?" Dawson sighed. "You already know the answer, Carter. You just don't want to believe it." "Believe what?" "That Silver Hills ain't just a town. It's a cage." Daniel swallowed hard. He had suspected something was off about this place since he arrived, but this was different. "I don't have time for this," Daniel growled. "We need to go after her. Right now." Dawson nodded. "You sure? 'Cause if we go in there, we might not come back." Daniel's grip on his gun tightened. "Then let's make sure we don't leave without her." Without another word, they moved. The path of no return. The moment they stepped past the tree line, the world changed. The temperature dropped sharply, their breath turning to mist. The air felt thicker, like pushing through invisible water. Daniel's heartbeat pounded in his ears. The shadows moved. Not like the rustling of wind or the flickering of tree branches, but like figures lurking just out of sight, shifting deliberately. Then came the whispers again. But this time, they spoke his name. Daniel. He stopped dead in his tracks. That voice, it was familiar. Too familiar. He turned sharply, gun raised, scanning the darkness. "Don't listen to them," Dawson warned, stepping in front of him. "They'll use whatever they can to get inside your head." Daniel swallowed, trying to push back the rising sense of dread. But then, a rustling. A low giggle echoed from somewhere deeper in the woods. Then, a child's voice. Soft. Almost playful. "Come find me." Daniel's blood ran cold. It was Ethan's sister. She was calling out to them. Without hesitation, he ran. The clearing that shouldn't exist. The trees thinned out suddenly, revealing a clearing bathed in eerie, silver light. A massive stone structure loomed ahead, something that had no business being in Silver Hills. It looked ancient, with weathered carvings covering its towering surface. Symbols, spirals, and something that looked almost like eyes. And standing in front of it, Ethan's sister. She was barefoot, her blood-stained dress hanging loosely around her tiny frame. Her arms dangled limply at her sides, and her head was tilted slightly, as if listening to something only she could hear. Daniel rushed forward, but Dawson grabbed his arm. "Wait." Daniel jerked away. "She's right there." But Dawson was shaking his head, his face pale. "That ain't her." Daniel turned back to the girl. She was smiling now. But it wasn't the smile of a scared child. It was wrong, stretched too wide, teeth gleaming under the moonlight. She lifted a hand and pointed toward the carvings on the stone. Daniel's blood ran cold. The symbols were shifting. Changing. And then, the stone opened its eyes. The eyes in the stone. A deep, guttural sound rumbled through the air. The ground trembled beneath their feet. Daniel's mind screamed at him to run. The thing carved into the stone was alive. And now, it was waking up. The girl turned back to them, her grin widening. You shouldn't have come. The shadows around them moved. From the trees, figures emerged. Dozens of them. People, or at least, what used to be people. Their skin was pale, their eyes sunken. Some were missing parts of their faces. Others had deep carvings burned into their flesh, the same mark Dawson had shown him. And then, Daniel saw him. Ethan. The little boy stood among the crowd, staring blankly ahead. His shirt was still blood-stained, his expression lifeless. And then he spoke. In a voice that wasn't his own. You don't leave Silver Hills. Daniel's stomach twisted. He raised his gun. Dawson grabbed his arm. You can't kill what's already gone. Daniel's hand trembled. His instinct screamed at him to shoot, to fight, but deep down, he knew Dawson was right. There was only one way out. Not by fighting. By breaking the town's curse. Daniel turned back toward the stone. If Silver Hills was a cage, this thing was the lock. And he was going to break it. The price of freedom. The eyes that watched. Daniel Carter had always believed that evil was something you could see, something that could be fought, arrested, or shot. But standing before the ancient, living stone in the depths of Silver Hill's cursed woods, he realized how wrong he'd been. This was evil. Not a person. Not a crime. Not something you could lock away. It was something that waited. Watched. Fed. The massive stone structure pulsed like a living heart, its many carved eyes opening one by one, glowing with an eerie, silver light. The figures surrounding the clearing, people who had once been normal, now empty husks, stood motionless, their faces slack. And in the center of it all, Ethan's sister smiled, her small, delicate hands reaching for the stone as if in worship. Dawson stood frozen beside Daniel, gripping his shotgun like a lifeline. His face was pale, but his voice was steady. We destroy that thing, he said. Or it takes us too. Daniel swallowed hard. And how do we do that? Dawson exhaled through his nose. Blood. That's how it was made. That's how it ends. Daniel stiffened. You're saying. But before he could finish, the ground beneath them shifted. A deep, rumbling groan filled the air, like the earth itself was breathing. The figures around them moved in unison, stepping forward as one. Their sunken eyes glowed faintly, and their mouths stretched into eerie, silent smiles. And then. They lunged. The fight for survival. Daniel barely had time to raise his gun before one of the husks slammed into him, knocking him backward. He hit the ground hard, the breath ripped from his lungs. Above him, a rotting face stared down, eyes empty sockets, mouth stretching into something that should have been a grin. Its hands clawed at his throat. Daniel jammed his gun between them and fired. The creature jerked back as the shot tore through its skull. But it didn't stop. It just kept coming. Dawson fired his shotgun, dropping another one of the figures, but more were closing in. They weren't human anymore. And they weren't stopping. Daniel kicked the husk off him and scrambled to his feet. Dawson, this isn't working. Dawson didn't answer. He was already moving, toward the stone. Toward Ethan's sister. She stood before the monolith, her small hands pressed against it, her lips moving in silent whispers. And then. She turned. Her eyes met Daniel's, and for a brief second, she looked like a normal, scared little girl. But then she smiled. And the whispers became a roar. The figures screamed in unison. The stone's carved eyes glowed brighter. The very air around them vibrated, pressing against Daniel's skull like something was forcing its way inside. Dawson reached into his coat and pulled out a knife. Without hesitation, he sliced his own palm open. Blood dripped onto the ground, and immediately, the figures froze. The stone shuddered. The whispers stopped. For the first time, Daniel heard nothing. And then the girl screamed. The sacrifice. The girl fell to her knees, clutching her head. The monolith trembled, deep cracks forming along its surface. The ancient carvings shifted, twisting into something chaotic, something breaking apart. Dawson took a staggering step back, his face going pale. "What the hell did you do?" Daniel shouted. Dawson's breathing was ragged. "Blood. The one who wakes it must pay the price." Daniel's stomach dropped. Ethan's sister was the sacrifice. The whispers had stopped because the stone was taking her instead. Daniel took a step forward. "We can't just let it." But Dawson grabbed his arm, shaking his head. "It's the only way, Carter." Daniel turned back to the girl. She was sobbing now, her small hands clawing at her own skin, her mouth opening in a silent scream as the stone's cracks widened. The husks around them collapsed, their bodies disintegrating into dust. And then, the monolith split open. The breaking of the curse. A brilliant white light erupted from the cracks, swallowing everything in its path. Daniel threw his hands up, the force of it knocking him backward. For a moment, he felt like he was floating, suspended in that blinding radiance, his body weightless. And then, silence. When he opened his eyes, he was lying on his back, staring up at a night sky filled with stars. The clearing was gone. The trees were still. And the stone. It was dust. Daniel pushed himself up, his entire body aching. He turned, searching frantically. Ethan's sister was lying on the ground. Still. Dawson was already beside her, checking for a pulse. His shoulders sagged with relief. "She's alive." Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It was over. The stone was gone. The curse, whatever it had been, was broken. And the whispers were finally silent. The cost of truth. By the time they made it back to town, dawn was breaking over Silver Hills. Ethan's sister was unconscious but stable. Ethan himself had no memory of what had happened. Neither did anyone else. As Daniel and Dawson walked through the quiet streets, he noticed the difference immediately. The air felt lighter. The oppressive, watching presence that had always seemed to linger in Silver Hills was gone. They had freed the town. But at a cost. As Daniel looked at Dawson, he saw something in the older man's eyes, something hollow. Dawson had known what they would have to do. He had known the town's secret all along. Daniel exhaled. "This wasn't just a case for you, was it?" Dawson shook his head. "I grew up here. I left when I was 18, but the town, it called me back. It always does." Daniel frowned. "But it's over now, right?" Dawson didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the distant woods. The trees stood silent, bathed in the soft glow of morning. And then, barely above a whisper. "For now." Epilogue, the whisper that remains. 3 nights later, Daniel sat alone in his apartment, going through his case notes. He had written everything down, every strange occurrence, every unexplainable event. But even with all the evidence, he knew the truth would never be told. Some things weren't meant to be understood. Just as he was about to turn in for the night, something made him pause. A sound. A whisper. Faint. Almost impossible to hear. But there. His blood ran cold as the words slithered through the air, carrying from the shadows of his room. "You don't leave Silver Hills." Daniel turned sharply. But there was nothing there. Just darkness. And the feeling of something watching.